Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala ashrafil anbiya wal mursaleen Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in amma ba'd. أوصيكم ونفسي أولا بتقوى الله تعالى عز وجل فقد قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون صدق الله العظيم. Today I want to discuss the issue of polygyny, تعدد زوجات, from the perspective of the Islamic sources and mainly and namely the Qur'an. Now, I'm going to go about this topic at length. So, because this is online, if you don't have time to listen to this now, then don't listen to it now because it will require some serious concentration and will require some investment from your part to follow along the argument presented here and also the counter arguments, which is how this will be presented. So first of all, let me outline my methodology. Now, there are various methodologies that are used in Islamic scholarship that yields various results, different results. Now, my methodology, specifically my methodology, is to look at the Qur'an in context of the Qur'an itself. This is my methodology specifically. Now, while many people will say that that is established as the normative methodology in tafsir, we find that in fact it is not used in that way very often, especially by contemporary scholars, and things are sort of mixed up altogether. So you will have someone quote a verse of the Quran, then quote a hadith, then an opinion of a scholar, and then come to a conclusion. Now, that's not how I do things. My methodology is to look at the Quran in and of itself first, look at everything the Quran has to say about the topic, see what we can deduce from that, then look at other secondary sources, look at the ahadith, and then look at the consensus of the scholars on the issue and across various sectarian divides. So looking for the primordial sunnah is how I like to call it. So that is my methodology. Now, first, I want to say that it is very important to follow a similar methodology because a lot of scholars, the way they interact with the Quran is as if they are saying that the Quran contradicts itself. Now, they will not say it directly, but that is the implication. So, for example, they will quote one verse of the Quran and then they will nullify that verse by quoting another verse of the Quran and saying that this verse nullifies that verse. Now, this is problematic because the Quran in and of itself says that were this Quran from other than Allah, then you would find in it a lot of contradictions. So when you view the Quran in this way, as if to say that verses in the Quran are contradicting itself, then you have a few options in front of you. The first option is, it's not from Allah. Now, of course, as a Muslim, that's not an option I can accept. The second option is that the verses in question do not actually contradict themselves, and the way in which it is being understood is incorrect. That is the more likely and obviously the only option if you believe in Allah and His book and His prophets, then that would be the only option. And so this is the approach that I'm taking regarding this topic of polygyny, but any topic, Islamic topic, this is how I specifically go about it. So let us first present the counter arguments, and then I will present an argument. So the background of the issue on polygyny from a socio-cultural perspective, when Islam was being established in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and subsequent to that, is that polygyny was normative. What do I mean by that? I mean that polygyny was considered acceptable, normal, and even expected. So were you to live in the time of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you married an Arab man, say from Quraysh, like the Prophet was from Quraysh, you would not expect him to be monogamous. You would not expect him to have one wife, because it was quite common for people to have more than one wife. And so because it was normative, it was never the expectation that someone would have one wife, and therefore the orientation on how Islam was engaged with was never from a monogamous standpoint to begin with. So this is what we need to understand. And so trying to underwrite Islam with a monogamous narrative was not something that people would be motivated towards in that time, and hence you don't find a lot of early literature that is specifically geared towards monogamy. Marriage is not discussed in monogamous terms in the Qur'an to begin with. Okay. But we do arrive at a point in history, and especially in more recent history, where monogamy is the dominant discourse, and where the Qur'an is looked at from a monogamous perspective, and hence we problematize the fact that the Qur'an allows polygyny. So we problematize it first, and then we limit it, and then we abrogate it in a sense. So that's what apologists do, and even what some people who would consider themselves classical scholars who are apologists do that. Okay? So that's the first point. So what is the argument that they make, first of all? Okay, so this is what we're going to look at it from the Qur'an. The argument they make, first of all, is where the Qur'an says in Surah Nisa, that, let me go to the English text, okay? In chapter 4, verse 3, Surah An-Nisa, ayah number 3, it says, "And if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of women, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just, then marry one or those your right hand possesses. That is more suitable, that you may not incline to injustice." So this is the verse that's quoted for those who oppose polygyny and for those who are in favor of polygyny. They both quote the same verse, and then they do various kinds of gymnastics around it. Okay, hermeneutics. So the modern discussion, obviously, this is what the assumptions are. Monogamy is the rule and polygyny is the exception. That's the first assumption in the modern discussion for those who are pro-monogamy. The second one is that the verse introduces polygyny. So this verse in the Quran, they treat it as if this verse introduces polygyny. And then the third assumption is that the verse is recommending men to marry orphans if they want to practice polygyny. So polygyny is now qualified by marrying orphans. This is how they look at the verse. So let us analyze those claims, okay? When we look at the beginning of the verse, it says, if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, okay? So this is why they say, therefore, this not dealing justly with the orphan girls means, in their interpretation, that these orphan girls will not be able to find a husband, and therefore it's an injustice to them. And in that case, with a surplus of orphaned girls, men should marry women 2, 3, and 4. This is the argument. But this argument, unfortunately, is absent the context of the verse, and absent the context of the surah, and absent even the context of the immediate verse before that. Okay? So if you fear that we will not deal justly, you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, you will notice that it's a continuation of the previous verse, which is about giving the orphans their property and not unlawfully consuming it. So let us go to the verse before that, which says, and give to the orphans their properties, and do not substitute the defective of your own for the good of theirs, and do not consume their properties into your own. Indeed, that is ever a great sin. And if you fear, so now the question is, what fear? Okay, you need to look at the context. So when you look at the context, this fear, and if you fear that you will not deal justly, this is that you will not deal justly with the wealth of the orphan girl under your care. And one way in which men would not deal justly with the wealth of the orphan girl under their care is that when the orphan girl reached of age, she reached puberty, and she had a significant amount of wealth, in order not to let go of that wealth, they would marry the orphan girl. And that is the immediate context. So hence a lot of translators have said, have inserted in the balance of the verse where it says, then marry those that please you of other women. They inserted in parentheses other woman 2, 3, and 4, meaning don't marry the orphan girl just to usurp her wealth. This is the immediate context of the verse, as is borne out through many verses in the Qur'an. How do I know that? Because the Qur'an tells you at great length not to and give to the orphan their wealth when they reach the age of marriage, meaning to set them to let them manage their own wealth, meaning don't just keep taking their wealth. But if you are poor, as the Quran continues, right, then there's no sin on you to use some of their wealth, meaning to maintain them in a fair way, in an equitable way, right? But if you are rich and you have your own wealth, then don't touch their wealth. So this is, the whole discussion is actually about wealth, okay? So the first assumption that monogamy is the rule and polygyny is the exception is debunked. Debunked because, in other words, one way of looking at the verse is to say, in layman's terms, why marry orphan girls under your care just to usurp their wealth, when you can marry any other woman that pleases you, any number of them, 2, 3, or 4. You understand? This is the argument. And then it says, but if you fear that you will not be just, then marry only one. Meaning, even to be fair, even to the women who are not orphan women, that you don't exploit them through marriage. And then marry only one. or those that your right hand possesses. Now, what is the relationship between marrying one wife and those that your right hand possesses? What's the difference between marrying one wife and or having a wedding, let me put it that way, wedding a concubine, that which your right hands possess, which is actually a concubine? Okay, the difference is the level of maintenance. The Qur'an also makes that clear. The Qur'an says, and if you don't have the wherewithal to wed a woman, then you may wed a concubine. Now, what is the difference between the two then? Why would you not have the wherewithal to marry a woman, but you will have the wherewithal to marry, quote unquote, a concubine? Because there's a difference in wealth disparity. The maintenance is lower. That's what it is. Okay? For that which your right hand possess versus the wife. So this discussion here is clearly about wealth, and you can see the discussion is about wealth because the prelude to the discussion is introduced with the issue of wealth. And this is what it is talking about initially, okay? So the assumption actually is that this is anyway a polygynous society. That's the assumption of the Qur'an. The assumption is also that this verse does not introduce polygyny. If you look at the assumption of the Qur'an, I mean the background of the Qur'an, the way the Qur'an talks about it, is that it's not introducing polygyny. It's not even saying that you are limited. This verse in fact doesn't introduce polygyny at all. It's just saying don't rob the orphan girl of her wealth. That's what it's saying. And it's saying don't even do it through marriage. And why would you want to do it through marriage when anyway you marry other women? You can marry other women 2, 3 or 4. So in other words, marry other woman that pleases you because you can do that. Why do you want to do this injustice to the orphan girl just to usurp her wealth? Okay, now you don't have to take my word for it, okay, because we will get to a point where I will show you that this was in fact the view of the mother of the believers, Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, who explained the verse in that way in a hadith. So you will see that, okay? But I want us to just focus for now. We're only going to focus on the Qur'an, like I said. But just as a caveat, just to absolve myself from people trying to say that I'm making this up. By the way, I'm not making it up. But it's even without the hadith, it's clear from the Qur'an actually that that's what it means, or that is a likely possibility of what it means. Okay, so let us continue. So the situation to which it refers is that of men who have orphan women already under their care and who are inclined to usurping their wealth. In other words, if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls because you are only interested in their wealth, then marry women besides the orphan girls of your choice. It doesn't end there because the next verse goes on to explain that even in that case, if you marry other women, don't try to usurp those women's wealth like you have tried to usurp the wealth of the orphan. And so it goes on further, so you can see the context is clear. The very next verse, after the verse that mentions polygyny, no, it doesn't introduce polygyny, it mentions it. And give the woman, upon marriage, their bridal gifts graciously. But if they give up willingly to you anything of it, then take it in satisfaction and ease. Okay? So, what is it saying? Again, still the topic is wealth. Still the topic is money. Still the topic is spending. That is what the whole discussion is about. The discussion is actually not about polygyny. Polygyny is in passing that, look, do not usurp the wealth of the orphan. Okay, if you do polygyny, don't try to do polygyny to usurp the wealth of woman, basically, is what it's saying. Because when you marry these women now, you want to be stingy, basically. Okay? So the Qur'an is saying, don't be stingy. Give their bridal gifts to them graciously, not with a stingy heart and not wanting to give it to them really. And then when you give it to them, you want to take it back. The Qur'an is talking about this very specific type of stinginess that's going on here. Okay? And it's clear that that's what it's talking about. So hence, we can see that this is about money. The verse does not establish polygyny again, rather it mentions it in passing in relation to not being unfair towards women regarding their wealth. A society that already practiced polygyny didn't need it to be introduced. And that is the point, okay? So let us continue and say, and this is how I want to debunk the common argument, and I will show you further where I write. Since many modern scholars are saying that the verse refers to marrying orphan girls in polygyny as an exception to a monogamous rule, we will now examine whether that is plausible. Let us then assume that the verse is talking about marrying orphan girls to entertain their argument and reinterpret the verse accordingly. Remember, this is one entire verse, okay? Verse 3 of chapter 4 is an entire verse that must be taken as an entire verse. You can't take one segment and say it contradicts another segment, okay? So let us read the entire verse and insert orphan girl for each time that marriage is mentioned, okay? Because they're saying this is regarding marrying the orphan girl. So let us look at it. So this is how the verse would read if we insert the word orphan girl. And if you fear that you will not deal justly with the orphan girls, then marry those that please you of orphan girls, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be just to orphan girls, then marry only one orphan girl or those whom your right hand possesses of orphan girls. This is most suitable that you may not incline to justice. You see, the Qur'an does not change topic midway. You cannot start a verse, okay, and say that this refers to orphan girls when it comes to 2, 3, or 4, so you must marry 4 orphan girls. But when it comes to monogamy, then it doesn't refer to orphan girls. You can't do that. So let us continue. So the verb in the sentence, which is marry, okay, to marry, cannot initially relate to orphans when applied to the polygynous bit, and then not be applied to the rest of the sentence. Hence, if the verse is saying that men should marry orphans in polygyny, then it must similarly apply to monogamy, because the verse goes on to talk about the monogamy, right? Then marry only one. Therefore, every man should only marry orphans whether in polygyny or monogamy. Let's assume that the verse does refer to orphan girls and that it is instructing Muslims to marry orphans. Then the verse wouldn't have any bearings on what men do regarding their marriages to all other women who are not orphans. In other words, Muslim men can marry orphan girls in polygyny and all other types of women in polygyny as well. Since polygyny was already established as a practice, this verse being in relation to orphans has no bearing on polygyny in general, but will only have limited men regarding what they do with orphans. In other words, the verse would be, you can marry 2, 3, 4 orphan women. But obviously, you don't only need to marry orphan women, that's obvious, women who are orphans. So that means you can marry other women also, and 4 orphan women. That's if you put the word off, if you say the verse applies to orphan girls. The truth is that this verse isn't about polygyny. Rather, the subject matter is about not usurping the wealth of orphans. Polygyny is mentioned in passing as an alternative to stingy male guardians who are after the woman's money. When we read verses of the Qur'an, we need to establish what the core argument is about before we jump to conclusions. The opposition to polygyny is a good example of how a popular narrative is superimposed on the Qur'an, because in the 21st century, monogamy is encouraged. The argument doesn't end with this verse. when they try to deduce monogamy as a supposed best practice from the Qur'an. There are at least two other verses commonly used to explain that the Qur'an prefers monogamy. Needless to say, the Qur'an allegedly always prefers what people themselves prefer in any era, because people always impose their perceptions onto the text. They want to guide the text to what they find is best for themselves and their culture. So the next verse in question, in chapter 4, which talks about polygyny, and also I want you to notice that the Quran addresses marriage in polygynous terms. So you can see verse 129 in chapter 4 says, "You will never be able to treat your wives with equal fairness, however much you may desire to do so, but do not ignore one wife altogether, leaving her suspended as if between marriage and divorce. If you make amends and remain conscious of God, He is most forgiving and merciful." The common argument is that in one verse, verse 3, God says, "If you cannot do justice, then marry only one." And in another verse, verse 129, He says, "You will never be able to be just to your wives." And hence, the declaration is actually a tacit denial of polygyny by God Himself. Since God is Himself stipulating justice as a condition for polygyny, and then stating that one can never do justice, God must then be saying one can never practice polygyny. Feminist Muslims are very fond of this argument because polygyny in real terms sets men apart from women in ways feminists are very uncomfortable with. The latter verse I quoted here also has a broader context, which has to do with a woman who is unhappy with her husband's disregard for her, as seen in the verse prior to the verse under discussion. So again, a practice of decontextualizing the Quran, taking one verse out of context, then taking another verse, then copy and pasting. Okay, this is not how we're supposed to read the Quran, first of all. And if you are saying the one verse contradicts the other verse, then you don't believe the Quran is from Allah, because the Quran itself tells you, were it from other than Allah, you would see contradictions in it. So if you are seeing contradictions in it, you don't believe it's from Allah. That's the bottom line. So let's continue. It says, the latter verse I quoted here also has a broader context. And the broader context is what? So we go to the verse before. Okay, verse 128. So again, verse 129 says, "You will never be able to be just to them, no matter how hard you try." And then, or the part that they find relevant, of course, the copy-paste part, right? But if we go to the context, it will tell us exactly what is being meant by this statement. So verse 128 of chapter 4 says, "And if a woman fears from her husband contempt or evasion, nushuz, there is no sin upon them if they make terms of settlement between them, and settlement is best. And present in human souls is stinginess." Again, it's about money, about wealth. "But if you do good and fear Allah, then indeed Allah is ever with what you do acquainted." And then it continues to the next verse, 129, which reads, "You will never be able to treat your wives with equal fairness, however much you may desire to do so, but do not ignore one wife altogether, leaving her suspended. If you make amends and remain conscious of God, He is most forgiving and merciful." So what is it talking about? Now, a lot of interpreters, of course, I think it is based on a statement of one of the early generations. I'm not sure if it was Ja'far as-Sadiq or one of the interpreters who said that the verse of stating you will never be able to be just refers to the man's feeling in his heart, and he doesn't have control over that. Now, this is an interpretation, but this too is not contextually driven, to be fair, okay? Because the verse is clearly talking about wealth, based on the context. So this is not about feelings. He can never do justice with his feelings. It's not talking about that. Okay? It's talking about the man is not doing justice because he has contempt for his wife. And he can't help that. That contempt. And it's not just cut and dry his feelings in the sense that we tend to understand it today. Okay, so I'm not saying that, of course I'm not going to say that Ja'far as-Sadiq, if that's what he said, was wrong, but I'm just giving greater context to the statement, because we decontextualize even the statements of these people. Okay, so let us continue. And so the point is here, to get a greater sort of understanding around the broader context, we need to understand exactly what is going on here. So I'm going to give this in a scenario, okay? So the terms of settlement here is to negotiate or renegotiate the maintenance to give to a wife which is less than what would be considered fair from her perspective. That's what it's saying. That's why the verse is saying, so do not leave her hanging. The verse goes on and says, right, it says here, leaving her suspended. Don't leave her suspended altogether. Do not ignore one wife altogether. So what does it mean here? It's saying here, but to make a terms of settlement. So the terms of settlement is negotiated. It's a negotiated settlement. Okay, the man has now taken a disliking towards a wife of his. It can happen when you have multiple wives, okay? Now what he does is he neglects her. This is the scenario. He neglects her. He does not go to her. So she's just there, parked, basically. It's like having her on permanent standby but never going. So she doesn't get her rights as a wife, okay? But the guy is saying, look, I've developed a sense of contempt for this woman, okay? And the verse is telling us as believers how to deal with the situation. So the dealing with the situation is that if I still want to retain this woman as my wife, then I need to come to a terms between me and her, negotiate terms between me and her, even if it is reduced. Which is why the verse says, don't leave her hanging, meaning don't ignore her altogether. Okay? But I can negotiate lesser terms. So for example, I can say, okay, look, I now have these other wives, and this wife is just a pain for me, really. It's not that I dislike her altogether, but she's a pain, and I have contempt for her. But as a Muslim and as a believer, I cannot leave her parked. So either I need to come up with terms between me and her that we negotiate and settle on, maybe less visitation. So I'll, instead of seeing her every third night, maybe she's the third wife, I will agree to see her 3 times or 4 times a month. Okay, because I don't feel I have that much need of her, and I don't much really want to see her that much. Okay, people need to be honest. And hence also because now I feel like, look, if I don't have that much inclination towards her, I may be stingy, because the Qur'an addresses this. In human souls is stinginess, it says. So now I may feel like I'm being stingy, and I'm thinking to myself, why should I maintain her? Look, this woman is of little benefit to me now. Why should I maintain her? So now I'm stingy. I don't want to pay the maintenance. So the Qur'an is saying you can make a settlement to even reduce the maintenance, and you can make a settlement to reduce the time spent with her. That is what it's saying, in exchange for keeping her as a wife. And we will see now contextually why that is the case. So let me continue. It says, this verse is regarding the fear of unjust treatment from the woman's perspective, which can be dismissed by agreeing to terms that might seem fairer to her or less fair, but will result in him not divorcing her. However, failing to come to terms in that regard, or having come to a financial agreement, the next verse continues. So in other words, we look at it in context. What does the next verse say? What does it say? Verse 129. You will never be able to treat your wives with equal fairness, however much you may desire to do so. But do not ignore one wife altogether, leaving her suspended. If you make amends and remain conscious, he is most forgiving and merciful. The verse is saying that now you have done as God has ordered and tried to come to terms with your complaining wife who fears disloyalty and abandonment from you. You have offered her new terms as part of your negotiation, but it failed, or it was unfair in nature because you are going to pay her less than your other wives. The response of God is that you will never be able to treat your wives fairly, no matter how hard you have desired and tried to do so. So judge as judged by your wife's estimate. She's always going to say you're unfair. In other words, this wife who fears abandonment from you is always going to say you are unfair. And no matter what you do, she's going to say you're unfair. That's what it's telling you, in fact. And it's also saying that because of how you are anyway trying to negotiate lesser terms with her. So you are not being fair. But the Qur'an is giving you a concession. And what is the concession? It says, however, despite her complaining about you being unjust and you taking a disliking towards her, do not ignore her altogether, leaving her suspended. So the concession is that even though you have this wife and now you don't visit her as much and you don't spend as much on her, don't leave her hanging. Don't just keep her there and you are not giving her marital rights. It doesn't have to be equal rights. That's what it's saying. It is a natural inclination of a man to leave a woman who constantly complains about him and simply just continue to visit with his other woman. God is saying, do not do that, but either continue to visit her, at least enough for her to still be considered your wife, because you have sexual relations with her, or divorce her and be done with it. In other words, don't leave the matter suspended in the air, but resolve it one way or another. The verse also sets up a rule around the negotiations made with a troublesome wife. You cannot keep her as a wife, even though you maintain her, while not going to her bed. Verse 128 is implicitly talking about material maintenance, whereas verse 129 is implicitly talking about spending time with your wife. If you find your wife so repugnant that you cannot sleep with her within a period long enough for her to endure the iddah, the waiting period, of a deceased husband, which is 4 months and 10 days, then you should offer to divorce her. If she is of an age that she no longer desires sex and can hold to the limits of God regarding marriage even without sex, she can herself offer to remain in the marriage. The follow-up verse makes it clear that this is actually the subject under discussion in these verses. So verse 130 of chapter 4 goes on and says, but if they divorce, Allah will enrich each of them from His abundance, and ever is Allah encompassing and wise. So what is it saying? After finally you couldn't come to an agreement on the issues of wealth and being stingy and not wanting to spend, and either sometimes wanting to retain a wife because she has money and you like the fact that she has money, so you're getting some of her money, right? So you just want to keep her there hanging for her money, because you remember the earlier discussion, taking the woman for her money, right? And now, or you're keeping her there but you don't want to spend money on her, and it's all about money this way and that way. That's most of these verses is talking about wealth, right? The Quran is saying that even if you separate, meaning now you have to separate physically, right? Divorce, and but also that separates your money situation from each other, then Allah says He will enrich each of them from His abundance, and ever is Allah encompassing and wise. So this makes the subject clear. Okay, God is, in the above verses, dismissing the insecurities people fear around divorce and the reduction of wealth. This reinforces the fact that the verses are primarily talking about maintenance in wealth. In other words, if the situation is untenable for the wife, you seem no longer inclined to, which is why she fears disloyalty from you, that you will not uphold your duties on account of disdain for her, then first negotiate new terms. These terms must include maintenance and visitations at a reduced level if agreed upon. However, the terms should not be such that the wife's situation is compromised to the extent that she is no longer a wife to you. Yet still married to you, and can therefore not be a wife to anyone else. God forbids that you oppress woman. Hence, you are not to turn away from her altogether, leaving her suspended, but rather you are to go to her and continue to have sexual relations with her, or set her free if you are unable to do that because your dislike for her has become severe. If anything, the above verses discussed show that polygyny was quite normal, as was the problems of polygyny. The Qur'an addresses the issue of marriage in polygynous terms because it was the typical kind of marriage prevalent during and after the time of revelation. So that is going into the subject. Now, just for a brief discussion on from what we know of history and the hadith, okay, we will see that the Prophet ﷺ, he practiced this with his wife, the mother of the faithful, Sauda alayha salam. He practiced it with her because he told her that he's no longer in need of her, because he was an honest man. She was a woman that was, I believe, slightly older than he was. He had these younger wives who were much younger than him, and he had no desire to sleep with her. So he offered her an offering in line with the Qur'an, and he said, look, I can set you free, meaning that you no longer beholden to me, because he's demonstrating, he realizes the unfairness of the situation, that he is no longer desirous of her in that way. But she says that, O Messenger of Allah, I want to stay married to you, and I give up my nights because you are no longer in need of me, of my nights, right? That's what he's saying, for Aisha, as like a gift to you, because clearly you would appreciate that. Okay, so he accepted that, so as not to divorce her. And this is a negotiated settlement. This is what it's talking about. A negotiated settlement to retain the marriage, and people need to just be honest with each other. This is what it shows. Okay? Sometimes people will say, okay, look, this is harsh. Oh, marriage isn't just about sex. How can people have all these super romantic notions of things, but practically and fundamentally, marriage is very much about sex. Because the thing that symbolizes, ratifies marriage is in fact sex. And you can see this in terms of the Qur'an also. The laws of the Qur'an states, in brief, that if a marriage isn't consummated, if you don't have sex with a woman that you entered a marriage contract with, then she doesn't even have to wait the waiting period, the iddah. There's no iddah for her because the rights of the marriage is not ratified. There's no iddah. There's the possibility of her giving back the dowry, the mahr. If the mahr was given already, she can give it back, okay? Or she can give back half, or it can be negotiated, right? And to give it back is better. For example, the Qur'an tells us, right? But of course, the man can't force that it should be given back. So the thing is, there is, and then the maintenance, the rights of maintenance is not yet on the man. So if you enter, you have an aqdun nikah. It doesn't mean you're married to the woman, by the way. You have a marriage contract. The marriage is ratified when you have slept with a woman. That's how it works, right? So if you have a marriage contract with a woman, but you haven't touched her, so you just have the marriage contract, then she's not due maintenance, okay? She doesn't have marital rights over you yet. And you don't have marital rights over her yet until you have decided that you will ratify this contract now through the act of consummation. That is the actual marriage, the ratification of the contract. Okay? I know it is a problematic comparison that I'm about to make, but I'm going to make it anyway. And that is, it's like when you go and sign your contract to buy a car from the dealership. Okay? You sign the contract, you have the paperwork, you haven't yet picked up the car. It's like that. Okay? The car, you can still cancel the agreement because you haven't yet picked up the car. The car has not incurred damages. Okay? It hasn't driven off the lot yet. It's still brand new. So that is, there is a transactional nature to human relations, and we want to pretend that that transactional nature to human relations does not exist. But it does exist, and proof of that is, quite simply, that when a woman seeks marriage, she looks for a man who is able to look after her most of the time. She looks for a man who has enough wealth so he can look after her and the children that may come from the relationship, and so she can feel comfortable and safe and protected. That's a transaction she's engaging in. The man, in turn, he looks for a woman who he feels is pretty, that he's going to want to sleep with, because you can't just obviously sleep with any woman. If you marry a woman and you find her unattractive, that's going to be a disaster, right? Because sex is very important to men. They rate it quite highly. He's going to look for a woman that's pretty. That's going to matter to him. She's pretty to him. In his eyes, she needs to be pretty, right? He's going to, that's like at a base level, but he's also going to look for a woman who's going to hopefully improve his life, make his life better. So he's going to look for a domesticated woman, perhaps, okay? Since he's going to be the provider, she's looking for someone who will provide. He wants to look for someone who will provide for him in other ways through her domestic abilities, as an example, right? So there's a transactional nature. Men choose women they think are suitable for them, and women choose men they think are suitable for them, and they do it on the basis of what the transaction will be in their estimate. Okay, and this is not only a fact of marriage, it's a fact of all relationships. You don't want a friend, a lot of people would not want a friend, for example, who is constantly in trouble and constantly in need of help. Non-stop. So much that your entire life will be busy. You'll be busy with helping your friend constantly. Okay? But you would never be able to call on that friend to help you because that friend's life is always in a mess, so the friend is never in a position to help you. You wouldn't like a friend like that, would you? Right? So this is kind of how the thing works. Okay? Now we can also look at, okay, this is the discussion in terms of the Qur'an. You can go to the relevant verses, but we can also look at some ahadith that ties in with these notions. Okay? And we can see that we got here in Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, we have a hadith. حدثنا علي ibn al-Hakam. Okay, right. This hadith says, let's see, English. Sa'id ibn. Okay, قال لي ابن عباس هل تزوجت؟ قلت لا. Okay, so here's a hadith. I'll just translate it. I don't know where the English is. Okay. Ibn Abbas asked me, radiallahu an, are you married? I replied, no. He said, marry, for the best person of this ummah of all other Muslims has the largest number of wives. Okay? So here, he means the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay? So he says, so marry, فَإِنَّ خَيْرَ هَذِهِ الْأُمَّةِ أَكْثَرُهَا نِسَاءً. Okay? So this is an example. So here, this is a blatant encouragement of marrying and marrying polygynous. Okay? To have many women. That's in Sahih Bukhari, in the book of wedlock marriage, nikah. Okay? And then we see and also then I mentioned the explanation of Aisha radiallahu anha of the verse, where she says the verse refers to men who want to marry the orphan girls only to usurp their wealth. So you can see that even it's not as if, and another point I want to make is that if you read Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, okay, are there ahadith that contradict the Qur'an in these books? Yes, there are. But they are only a handful. They are very few. This anti-hadith movement, this like, okay, we must only accept the Qur'an and the Qur'an is sufficient for us and there's no need to refer to anything else, is frankly not in line with the Qur'an, because the Qur'an calls you to reflect on many things actually in your environment, in your life, the Qur'an is a book that talks about everything around you. And so to say that, okay, look, we are now not going to read this or read that or read the books of the sayings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam because it was recorded so late on and many were fabricated, etc., etc., etc. That is just a dumb approach to have, in my opinion. And no offense to those people who have that approach, but I believe that is a dumb approach, because I believe that you need to be open-minded enough to learn from various sources. And if we believe in the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, which we do as Muslims, then we would want to know what he said. It would be important to us. We'd want to know how he lived. We'd want to know these things because he's the recipient of the revelation, and who better to inquire or find out, to give a reflection of the revelation in practical terms than the one who received it to begin with. So that, as a resource for understanding, it is an important resource. And since we have the resource, we should use it. If we didn't have the resource, that would be different. If the resource was altogether corrupted such that we could say that 90% of it contradicts the Qur'an, that would be a different story. But that's not the case. I must be blatantly honest and say, yes, are there narrations that contradict the Qur'an? Yes, of course there are. Is that by and large the majority of narrations in Sahih Bukhari and Sahih Muslim? The answer is no. That is just a handful, which you can problematize, and that's fine, because Sahih doesn't mean mutawatir. Sahih means that the chain of narrators are considered thabit, they're considered to be upright and good, and the links tally, and it's plausible that it goes back to the Prophet ﷺ, and that he said it or did it or was witnessed by people, or it was established. So these are it's like circumstantial evidence, basically, right? I would say. So you can't dismiss the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the history and frankly, it's not a good approach. Look, the Quran talks about, for example, the Battle of Badr. The Battle of Uhud is spoken about in the Quran. The Hijrah from Mecca to Medina when the two were in the cave. These are all historically known things which are spoken about and referred to and referenced in the Quran. Now, if you didn't know these historically known things from the documentation of historians and also from the reports, then you would, not that you wouldn't be able to understand the Quran, but there's a lot that you would be missing out on. Let's just put it that way. That's just from a historical perspective, but also then, of course, from the perspective of extrapolating meaning, okay? Meaning not meaning that is independent of the Quran, but meaning that is subservient to the Quran. Let's put it that way. Like how I did now, okay? I went through the Quran first, relevant things concerning the Quran, and now I'm looking at some of the prophetic sayings. And so we can see that, for example, and then there's the issue of, there's a few other issues, okay, that we can discuss around this, but I don't want to get too controversial on the topic. Okay, but we can see, for another example would be the issue of, that I want to highlight some point of, which is the issue of mamluk, okay, mulk al-yamin, that which your right hands possess, concubinage, because the verse does mention that. It says, right, that if you cannot, then if you fear being unjust, then marry only one, or that which your right hands possess. So now we must now obviously just look a bit into that. So let us do that. So we have Quran. Let's just go to, let's look at that for a bit, and then I will just stop there, okay? So the verse in question, of course, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I realized I didn't actually read the verse in Arabic. It says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ فإن خفتم ألا تعدلوا فواحدة أو ما ملكت أيمانكم ذلك أدنى ألا تعولوا. Okay, so this issue about O ma malakat aymanukum, I already mentioned that the thing is, the difference was that to marry a woman, what they translate as a free believing woman often, is usually more expensive than marrying the concubine. And that is why this is clearly in relation to wealth. And that is just what I want to highlight for you. Okay? So let me just show you that. Shadu Allah ilaha illallah. The adhan is going. I'm just going to wait. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Okay, so basically to conclude, just to corroborate, okay? So this year, the ayah in Surah Nisa, okay, is corroborated or further explained by another ayah in Surah Nisa. So in verse 25, we see it says, but if any of you cannot afford to marry a free believing woman. So now they translate, of course, al-muhsanat, right, to be the free believing woman, okay? Then what does it go on? It says, then let him marry a believing bondwoman, or that which your right hand possess. They will translate it as a slave woman, a believing bondwoman by one of you. Allah knows best the state of your faith and theirs. You are one from another, so marry them with the permission of their owners, giving them their dowry in fairness. If they are chaste, neither promiscuous nor having secret affairs, if they commit indecency after marriage, they receive half the punishment of al-muhsanat, of the free woman. Okay? This is for those of you who fear falling into sin. But if you are patient, it is better for you, and Allah is all forgiving, most merciful. So, as you can see here with this here, so this shows you the difference, okay? So, malakat aymanukum, okay, and al-muhsanat. And it corroborates this ayah, because why does it say, but if you cannot afford to marry? So it's showing you degrees of ability, okay? And the main issue is wealth. In the surah, this surah, for a large part of it, the main issue is wealth. So so in order of priority, in other words, if you can afford, فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَىٰ وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ, then you do that, okay? But now if you cannot afford to do that, meaning you are now going to be unjust because you cannot afford to do that, then فَوَاحِدَةً. But if you cannot even afford that, then مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. And that is in the context of the Qur'an. And I will have to end there because I want to head out to the masjid. Wa sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barik wa sallam. How do I stop this now?